so chilled, Wesley. So there. But in the meantime, I agree. He has to be aggressive on the chessboard. He has to kind of not back down, not let Magnus dictate the pace, the nature, the style of the game, not let Magnus bully him psychologically, which we've seen so many times from the world number one. Magnus lives rent-free in most of our heads. He just has to ensure, Wesley, that doesn't happen today. But we're almost at game time. We're almost off. We're awaiting the first moves. Magnus starts with white. Any predictions with the opening before it's too late? Oh, it looks like the Reti. He got there first.
Yeah, we didn't have a chance to put in our guesses, but I think Magnus, the lights are out, at least over his face. So he needs to work on that camera angle, but hopefully the lights are on upstairs in his head. Oh, and there we go. He takes that drink of water. And what do you make of the opening, Tanya, where Magnus, he hasn't decided to create tension in the center, at least not yet. Do you like this sort of cagey start from him?
Well, we see him do this quite often, but against Wesley, it's usually been the start with the king spawn opening or the queen spawn opening. At least that's what we saw traditionally in the Champions Chess Star. So a new approach, but with Wesley's speed that he's responded with, he doesn't look, or at least he's not acting to be too surprised with this. And now it's the big decision. How does Wesley keep the tension in the center here, Robert?
Well, he decides instead of to keep the tension, he is trying to avoid it for now. And David, Magnus strikes with b4, so he is trying to chisel at Black's pawn chain, and it is a pawn sacrifice. What do you make of this mini gambit?
Yeah, I've got to say I like it, but I also hate it. Firstly, you're a pawn down, so not my cup of tea, not the kind of favorite approach by many top players these days. You don't want to be too kind of materialistic in general, but here Magnus, his idea was to open up as many lines as possible, and Robert, you mentioned it's kind of a flank gambit. It's basically a reversed version of the Benko gambit, as we call it, but Wesley has said no, he bypassed this pawn. If Wesley earlier had captured on the a3 square, then white's rook would have opened up on the a file. There would have been open lines here for the white rook. White's bishop would have come out. So interesting that Wesley could have been a pawn up. He is temporarily, but this pawn will soon fall. And I don't know, have either of you two got experience in the Benko gambit? I must say, not my area of expertise.
No.
I've actually played this position with the white pieces where white pushes the b5 pawn from b5 to b6 and gives that pawn back. But again, to me, this feels like a cagey approach from Wesley trying to keep things secure, like his blanket that he's got on right now. But then again, this is the kind of stuff that can backfire against Magnus. Robert, does this surprise you that Wesley decided not to capture that a3 pawn?
Well, this entire opening has surprised me, and even Magnus's last move, pushing his pawn to a4 rather than recapturing on b3. Both sides are trying to lay claim to important space and squares. The b4 square for black is now firmly under control. And then for white, you have this light square diagonal. The bishop on g2 is unopposed on that diagonal. And so we could see that bishop shining its powers across the board. I don't know whose position I'd rather have. It's a new position to my eyes, but it feels like one where both players are on their own.
Yeah, it feels like both players have trump cards up their sleeve. You mentioned the b4 square. White's knight also has access to a beautiful outpost on b5 a bit later. First, Magnus wins the pawn back. And Tanya, from your experience, you mentioned you've kind of played this opening just with reverse colors. Do you think Magnus is going to be happy? Here, he's basically played an opening you usually see with black, but he's white, so he's got an extra tempo. Should he be happy about that?
And it's always tricky to kind of adjust yourself to these reversed colors opening. One of the ideas as white that I like in this, and that would mean a position that black has currently for Wesley, is to actually transfer that knight from f6 to the c5 square. We've been talking about how important these squares are. So there's often this plan of the knight falling back and then finding itself on c5, which is a nice square. I think Magnus, he was perhaps expecting a more dynamic approach by Wesley to capture that a3 pawn, to pick up that free pawn, which gives a lot of activity to white. And now he has to fight in this position. I like these positions, well, in this case for white, for black here, simply because that knight from f6 will land on the square of c5, which is a nice square. And I'm getting confused as a commentator with reverse colors. I have no idea how the players are handling it.
And I actually found that funny because I'm doing the same thing in my head because it is a Benko gambit colors reverse. And we saw for a quick moment this bishop b4 move from Wesley, perhaps the most natural move, developing your piece, getting ready to castle, putting on defended square. The engine didn't really approve it, and I think it's precisely because of what Magnus is doing. He can challenge this bishop immediately, and if white takes on b4, next move, that knight on c6 could not capture back, which is why Wesley right now brings his knight back to d7. That way the e5 pawn is well protected, and if the capture on b4 happens, he can successfully take back with a knight rather than doubling his pawns, which you may want to do in some positions, but here I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it feels like this is the two players just tiptoeing around each other. Magnus makes that decision. He trades off the bishops. And it's just a fight for squares. It's about maneuvering. And I've got to say, it feels like traditionally this would favor Magnus Carlsen. He's so good strategically, so good at kind of sensing where the important squares are, when to switch up the pace, the quickness of the game. But Wesley, he's done nothing wrong. And evaluation bar slightly preferring black. I've got to agree. Just we're kind of playing by association with colors reversed. Yes, Wesley's a tempo down on a known opening, but he's got everything covered. Tanya, your dream square on c5. That knight's going to be beautiful on this square. It feels like Magnus is taking some big risks early on in this game, and evaluation bar continuing to drop after Magnus's retreat there. The white knight wants to come around and stack on this pawn, but he's not going to get time, surely, Magnus. Tanya, are you agreeing? To my eyes, it looks fantastic for black.
Yeah, everything that you pointed out. And I also really like that Wesley captured on b4 with that pawn on a5. At first, it looks like you're spoiling your pawn structure. You're doubling up, but you're taking away some key squares from that knight on b1. Well, now the positions change. White had to spend some time picking up that pawn on b4, and we see the queens are going to get traded off because the a4 pawn is really weak. And just coming back to Robert's point earlier about this being a reversed Benko gambit and extra tempo that matters. I think Wesley's approach to go with the move b4 to b3 early on in the game, to not go for the picking up of the pawn, in these kind of positions, perhaps the extra tempo doesn't matter as much.
It doesn't, and it's because it's a relatively closed position, so I'm with you, Tanya. And Wesley just quickly played queen to a5. He released the tension. I think he's going into this game with the mantra, I'm going to try to draw with the black pieces and then press with white, because he could have kept his b4 pawn. I actually think that keeping more pieces on the board was favorable for black because white's pieces were stepping on each other's toes somewhat. Now after the queen trade, mass liquidation on the a file, the a4 pawn is dropping. I don't think that black is any worse at the moment, that's for sure, but I don't know if there's so many winning chances left because there aren't that many pieces remaining.
Ooh, and some of these moves in the game review here not proved of by the computer. This was a missed opportunity for Wesley, so to my eyes it looks like a very natural move. He's trying to gain time now against this white rook. Actually, if the queens disappear, I wouldn't be surprised, for example, on the next move, if the black king just shifts to d7, swings the other rook across, and if the queens are off the board, black's pieces are so actively placed. Wesley, so, at least to my eyes, turning things in his favor. I think Magnus really needs to kind of pull the brake, shift gears here, and try to make that draw. Wesley, on the camera, smiling as well. He looks thrilled with his position, and rightly so. I wish we could see how Magnus is feeling. That dark shadow. There we go. Brightening up suddenly, but I don't think his mood is feeling very bright with this position here. After the queen's leaving the board now, it's all about how active black's pieces are. Like Robert said earlier, this pawn is doomed. Sooner or later, Wesley can kind of take it at his leisure, and nothing at all to worry about here for black. It's just about whether he can try to turn it into an advantage even at some point.
And now the big question is, David, has Wesley Red grind like a grandmaster? Because it looks like it might be time to start thinking about that. An endgame, you got piece activity. The a4 pawn is about to fall. Black's king in the center is actually ideally placed because you don't even need to go shut castle anymore. You could go with your king to d7 as Wesley does it, bring the other rook into play. I'm loving Wesley's position right now.
I love the way Wesley's handling this because that pawn on a4 is not going anywhere. It cannot legally move, and it cannot be defended very easily. So black wants to set up the second rook over to a8 to keep control of this open file, or put a rook on b8 and then slam it down on b2. So that's why Magnus, realizing he doesn't have all the time in the world to just sit and see this rook get active, he decides to strike in the center with pawn to f4, and if the black pawn e5 is removed, d4 is loose. So these are some difficult decisions for Wesley. He might just push his pawn to f6 to keep a nice pawn chain, everything defended. But you see Wesley investing some time right now because there may be tactics with that black king on d7. It's still in the center of the board. There's still rooks on the position here. So I think Wesley, he's just trying to be accurate. What Magnus shook his head. He's not happy. Black is certainly no worse.
As you predict, Robert, there, black does play pawn to f6. We see a quick trade and Magnus activates his knight. This game looks like it's roughly in the balance, but perhaps Magnus here needing to be slightly more careful than Wesley, just to maintain that kind of equal position. Maybe it's time to jump over to check out another game. We'll update everyone, of course, on these developments. I want to check out the other game we've been talking about a lot, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave against Denis Lazovic. And we jump in at a moment where, again, a small cross, a missed opportunity for Black. Natural to me. Level material in this one. Robert, what are your first instincts about this position? How should we evaluate it?
Well, we come in and there's immediately a miss, right? Giving an X. And normally you would say that the Black's position looks quite solid to my eyes. The bishop on b2 for White, it's not playing. The knight on h4, where is it going? So perhaps Black had something a little bit stronger, but the position looks very sturdy from Denis Lazovic's perspective. I think he's handled this opening perfectly. He is not worse in the slightest, and I don't know where White even hopes to build an advantage from.
Tanya, are you kind of favoring either side here? It looks like maybe Denis has escaped the opening in good shape here.
I think both the games that we've checked out, Black is doing great. In this one, Denis, in the earlier one, Wesley, they've gotten out of the opening without too much trouble. This one is so symmetrical, the pawn structure, the minor piece balance, everything. No such weaknesses. That last move by Denis, c6, taking control of the central d5 square, making sure that White doesn't have any jumps with that knight on d5 anymore. So Maxime decides to improve the position of that other knight that you were pointing out. Knight coming back to f3, but I'm still not seeing how White actually makes progress. You can't really push the c pawn because the b4 pawn will be hanging there. So the b2 bishop still struggles to come into the game. I agree with both of you that for Denis, this has been a good start.
Great start for Denis Lazovic. And this one, it does feel like the calm before the storm. Long way to go. We look at the clock times with our new time control this season. Both players still with plenty of time left and 2-second increment to boot. Max slightly ahead on the clock there. But I think we should go back to that marquee game, to Magnus Carlsen against Wesley So, because that one feels like it's racing towards a conclusion. And yeah, we're deep into the endgame now. He's got a set of rooks off the board, but visually it looks so attractive, my eyes at least, for Black. Black's king more active in the center than White's. It can choose which direction to go later. Black's bishop keeping the White king feeling a bit uncomfortable for now, and at the right moment you still can take it enough. Robert, do you think Magnus here, has he kind of survived the worst, or can Wesley continue to be ambitious? He jumps in with a knight.
Wow, and he forced that rook to a. Whoa, what's he pre-moving? Knight to c1. I mean, if the rook went to a2, knight c1 would have picked up the e2 pawn, but Wesley trying to get that one anyway. And look at this, an exclamation point given to bishop to g4. He's trying to provoke this e pawn to push because a pawn chain is only as strong as its base pawn. And so the e2, d3, c4 pawn chain look nice and steady, everything well defended. But if you have to push up to e3, then that pawn on d3 becomes a target. Bishop d1 becomes available. And then knight on c2 is in some trouble. The a4 pawn remains loose. So White's pieces are awkwardly placed. I actually, at first was like, what's Wesley doing? Pre-moving. But he's that strong at even bullet chess that he understands the position, and the dynamics seem to be favoring Black.
Oh, look at this. Magnus just ignores the threat. What's his idea? This pawn is simply falling. And Wesley gobbles it up. He's trying to undermine the Black knight now, but Wesley, he's destroyed that pawn chain you were talking about, Robert. This is a piece sacrifice. He's given up his knight, and I'm assuming it's going to be captured. What else? And then Black will take the a4 pawn, and he's going to bank on these two connected passes in the center to just race down the board. Is this genius? Is this Magnus? Magnus, I was going to say. And, or was it a bit of both? Wesley to try and win this game.
I love it. I love this approach by Wesley. Magnus said his strategy against Wesley is about hustling him, hustling Wesley's lack of aggression. We've seen none of that. Wesley's going all out. He delays the picking up of the a pawn. He first picks up the central pawns, and now he's sacrificed an entire piece. But we've got to do a deep dive into this position because for the moment, Wesley's down a knight in the position. You're pointing out the e-pawn, also the black rook jumping onto that second rank with a ton of pinning ideas with rook a2 coming up. How much trouble is this? I see the eval bar says it's still even, but from a practical perspective, is Magnus feeling the heat right now?
I think he is. I mean, this position looks uncomfortable for white because the knight on c2 is already threatened by the bishop. As you mentioned, Tanya, rook a2 becomes an immediate threat. And let's say you want to jump your knights forward somewhere. Knight f3 is met by the simple king to d6, improving the location of the black king because you're defending your loose pawn. The king is active, used as a weapon in the endgame. So I'm looking at this position, and Magnus needs to be very careful here because if he makes a single mistake, it's no longer a balanced game. It's completely in Wesley's favor.
Guys, I want to make you guess the best move. I took a peek because I thought White's position is so ugly here, so unattractive. How does Magnus hold this together? What do you think White's best move is here? It's unfindable for a human. That's a big clue.
I'm gonna just like.
I'm gonna go with king e1.
Yeah, I was gonna actually say knight a1 because the way you asked the question is so leading, and it's not a natural move at all. But if anyone on this planet could find it, I think it's Magnus Carlsen.
Wow.
Look at him shifting in his chair there, Magnus, leaning forward. He knows this is a key position. I was attracted to your king e1 there, Tanya, as well. I think a very logical move, but in the end, after a move like pawn to c5, White's knights are just stuck, pretty much zugzwanged. But knight a1 is the best move according to the computer. The idea is to loop around this knight, to rotate it round to b3, and the knights, superfluous knights we sometimes call them, but they cling on to each other. For example, if the black rook drops down, knight to b3, and for now, you're holding. But this is so hard to evaluate. I mean, to my eyes, it looks like black plays Robert's move, king d6. The pawns are rolling, running. But after king to f3, you have a semi-blockade on some important squares, and the knight's surviving. But Magnus needs to find this move, and I think it's almost impossible. Knight to a1. He plays knight to f3 instead. And now Robert's move, king d6, looks like it gives black a big advantage. Black moving forward, in control. Question mark given to that move. We can't fault it. Very human, knight f3, especially in rapid chess. Who's going to look at a move like knight a1? And Magnus gives his piece back. This is going to be one-way traffic now. Level material yet again, but at the right moment, you can take this pawn. Not yet, because there might be some knight forks, some knight checks. So maybe Wesley takes some time out to guard against that. But yeah, feels like Magnus in big, big trouble in game one today.
Well, Tanya, I was about to ask you that Magnus up a piece for 2 pawns, but those pawns were running up the board, restricting White's pieces. Do you think this is a good practical try for Magnus? Because at least what he could envision for a draw, blockade on the dark squares, trying to take away some of these remaining black pawns. Do you think the draw seems more within reach now?
I think knight a1, the move that you were discussing, and Robert, that you pointed out, is so difficult to play and to even find. It's not even on your radar. A retreating move all the way back to a1. You're not sure how you're coming out of the fix that you're in. So you really want to try and simplify the position. I think you're on point. Magnus just wants to get out of this game. He wants to find the fastest way to neutralize. But this might not be neutralizing at all, because a bishop versus knight in these endgames is good news for black. You can try and push. You have to watch out for that knight on g7 getting trapped. Bishop to f7, it comes back. How are you retreating with the knight? If the minor pieces get traded off, this is winning for black. Are you going g4, king f5? A knight f5, I'm sorry?
Process of elimination, you have to play g4. This is the only route back for the white knight, but Wesley has cut off this square. f5 now taken away from the white knight, and a big threat. The knight's still trapped. Like you say, Tanya, if there's a trade, knight for bishop, black will win due to this distraction, the outside pass pawn. So Magnus now needs to keep his knight alive. Is it the move g5 just to stop the threat? But this is still incredibly ugly. You're playing without a piece, and black's pawn looks like it's racing down the board. He plays it, again, process of elimination, but is he going to save this game? Exclamation mark. Only move there from Magnus. He's surviving by the skin of his teeth. Robert, do you see any resources? Can black continue pushing?
Well, what white now wants to do is play h4, h5, and g6. Just get rid of that h7 pawn. Because if that pawn is no longer on the board, then the white pieces will go march on over to the c pawn, either blockade it or sacrifice the knight for that last pawn. A lone king and bishop cannot deliver checkmate, for those of you who are newer in the audience. So that is what white is aiming for. Get all of black's pawns off the board, even if you have to sacrifice your knight in the process. A great move, g5. h4 comes next. The black king kind of has to stay put, because as it goes up to f4, knight can now slide back to e6 with check, and the knight is safe.
Yeah, Magnus should be saving this game now that the white knight escapes that dungeon on g7.